Hello, everybody. Today is November 5th, and this is the OLM Dev Working Group. The only item on our agenda today was submitted by Chris and is a request to follow up on the discussion of operator scopes. So Chris, I'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, great. So last Thursday, we had our feature meeting, our OLM feature meeting, and we didn't really have any topics. So Evan and Daniel talked about the problem with scoping with operators, and the problem where namespace scopes versus cluster scopes and all the sharp edges and things like that that are in there. And I think the follow-up from that meeting is that there was really no great answer other than describing what the problem was. And so we were going to take it, I think, to Slack to have some discussions more on that. Internally in my company, we've been definitely having a lot of discussion on this because this is a very painful point for our customers. And so I'm just wondering if anything is happening behind the scenes to kick that off, and how do we want to communicate that more?
Evan, since you led that discussion, do you want to comment?
Yeah, absolutely. So continuing to have discussions about this, we can definitely follow up on Slack some more too. I think right now, I'm definitely still of the opinion that the thing that makes operators work in the best way for the most users is to have them all be cluster extensions, globally scoped, watching all namespaces, and then control access to their APIs via RBAC. That said, I think a lot of the other use cases we talked about need to have solutions more in the way that operators are written and shipped today. So maybe we don't have an operator group to spin up a controller for a set of namespaces, but instead we have some extension with the operator SDK that makes it really easy to write that feature for an operator itself if the operator needs to isolate tenants with separate controllers or something along those lines. So I definitely want to look more at that. I think that the biggest thing missing right now in my mind is we need to sit down and actually write out, if we make this decision that OLM is primarily concerned with cluster, singleton, Kubernetes controllers that are available in the entire cluster, what does the transition path to that from now look like? How do we provide all the necessary tooling and the SDK being one example of that, but what happens if you upgrade an existing cluster to a new cluster? This is probably, this type of decision would be something that would need to take place over a very long time scale to make sure that nothing gets left behind, basically.
So do you think that we now have operators so the operators as they're defined today become cluster scoped things that are extensions to the cluster control plane? And now do we have a new pattern that we call something else? They're not operators anymore?
Yeah, I think it makes, I think we have a couple references to this. Operator Lifecycle Manager used to be called the Application Lifecycle Manager. I think it makes sense to have, especially with the new dependency resolver, it makes a lot of sense to have things that are operators and extending the cluster be installable as dependencies by things that are not doing that. So it should still be totally possible to install some application, but then it depends, that application depends on some service that's actually provided by an operator. I think there's some work to do there in terms of figuring out what a good user experience is. But we've definitely talked in the past about, users probably don't, end users probably don't have the permissions required to install a cluster extension, but can we show them that AMQ Streams is available and they can click AMQ Streams and try and use it, and that triggers some sort of request mechanism to have someone that does have enough permission install the operator, and now that's available for all users on the cluster. So I think those are the workflows that I think we should think a little bit more about.
Yeah, so how should we facilitate that kind of discussion? I think this is think this is a fundamental piece that is going to really break adoption, and it's causing a lot of problems in various levels of the community, specifically my community. So what, I guess, how do we want to do we have to have meetings to do this, like once every 2 weeks, or do we, what do you have a suggested forum? It seems like we almost need a workshop to tackle through these things.
Yeah, I'd be interested, this is Mike Kazmarski, I'd also be interested in feedback you're getting from customers and going in this direction. I mean, I see customers, cluster administrators who install operators for specific departments or uses, and they install them at a namespace level so that that department and or that user can use them, but they're not really intended for broad open use across the whole cluster. And so they do try to implement some sort of workload isolation by namespace for the departments using their cluster. And I guess I jumped into this conversation a little late, but having everything be cluster scoped seems to have some tension with that workspace isolation or namespace isolation, workload isolation. Has this been tested against, you know, some enterprise customers who are actually using operators in their existing way?
It's definitely on our minds. We will be doing a lot of that research, and we would also, you know, like you said, if you have customers that are expecting certain things as well, that feedback is really valuable for this audience, from your perspective too. For that specific thing that you mentioned, though, you know, enabling an operator for an entire cluster doesn't mean that everyone has permission to use it. And workload isolation is really not something that operators address, right? That's something that other things in Kubernetes address or don't address at all. So if you have customers who are concerned about installing an operator that's available, or that's watching all namespaces or something like that, I would be curious to know if they feel the same way about like the pod controller or the pick any API in Kubernetes, right? You control access to it via RBAC. You don't control access to it via additional controllers that you spin up watching different sets of namespaces. So that's kind of the driving force behind this discussion in general, which is like the Kubernetes doesn't have the fundamental building blocks that you would want in order to do this the right way. So we don't really feel that we can do it the right way. So that means now that there are other ways you can do it, and that's, again, tooling via the operator itself. It's also spinning up different clusters for different tenants. If you have some department in some organization that needs true isolation, they probably should have a separate cluster or a separate set of nodes or something along those lines.
Yeah, it just seems like an interesting reverse in direction. So that's why I'd like to learn more about it. I mean, I've got on the order of 9 enterprise customers who are used to using it in a certain way and actually use it to kind of optimize the resources because they can use them across, you know, multiple areas, but they do want workload isolation. And so they scrutinize things like cluster permissions and RBAC for the operators they're installing, and really ask us a lot of questions about any kind of cluster permissions that they have. Because I believe if they don't have cluster-wide permissions, they can't deploy cluster-wide workloads. So you know, that's kind of the mental model I see them following. And so if they see cluster permissions in an operator, they really want to know why it has them and what it's going to do with them, because they're thinking in terms of this operator. If I deploy it, you know, and let some person in a namespace deploy it, who I've given access to this namespace, but it has cluster permissions, it has the opportunity to affect workloads running in other namespaces. And so that becomes a concern for them.
Yeah, so we discussed this in similar veins before. I highly encourage you to check out last week's OLM feature planning meeting, because we did discuss that detail a bit. I would just note that you had mentioned if giving namespace users the ability to install an operator right there, right? In that meeting, we actually cover how like installing an operator is a fairly highly privileged action, and it's one that really only like extending the control plane of the cluster is really a cluster admin permission and shouldn't really be done by namespace admins in general.
Yeah, I wasn't really talking to installing the operator. I was talking to actually deploying its operand.
Got it. Okay.
And it's usually namespace scoped people who, once the operator is installed and is available to them in their namespace, they can deploy it. And if that operator carries with it cluster permissions, that has implications that they're installing something that can affect things outside of their namespace, even though they don't have privileges outside of their namespace. Of course, there's side effects too, like the way it installs today. It installs in the namespace. It has a service account. Pods can hijack it, that service account. They can use its cluster permissions for other things too. So if what we're saying is that things installed with operators, aren't going to give you workload isolation, we should just say that, and people, teams and software developers will not use operators to install applications or other things like that, right? In which case, maybe Helm was a better choice for these kinds of things. Helm 3 in particular.
So I think the missing piece here is that when you're installing the operator, that's a service that's now available. So that's the distinction between something like Helm, which does let you package up and deploy an application into a namespace with whatever permit is held through with whatever permissions you have as a user. What operators give you is the ability to encode that into a service that's now available for all tenants in the cluster. And so, like going back to your example of workload isolation for a particular department in an organization, if you install an operator today and it's only available for that one department, the thing that's missing is that department is a tenant of a bigger cluster. And so when you start looking at, okay, now I want to enable that for someone else, if I have to install that same operator again in another namespace, that's where things start to break down, because you can do it to a degree, but so many of the things that make the operator an operator are cluster scoped and can conflict and cause a bunch of problems. And that's where we went and we covered a lot of like the specific problems last week.
Yeah, I saw that. Thank you. I wasn't clear from that presentation, though, that we were jumping to the conclusion that everything is cluster scoped, including possibly the permissions. The customers I talk to scrutinize the CSVs for the operators that are deployed, and they look at the cluster permissions in those CSVs. And if those CSVs have cluster permissions that look like they could affect other workloads, usually anything other than get, list, watch type of permissions, then they question whether or not they can use those operators for any kind of offerings that they want to isolate to a particular team in a particular namespace, because that operator or its operands, because those cluster permissions inherently can affect other workloads in other namespaces. And I've seen that behavior, with a number of customers. So it's kind of like running as root, right? They don't want their applications with those kinds of permissions. So maybe it's for certain classes of services that it makes sense to install operators. And maybe for other classes of services, in other words, you know, if operators are essentially kernel extensions, fine, we'll leave them there as kernel extensions. But I think then customers don't want applications who have kernel extensions, right? So there would have to be some other mode or install mode or way for them to deal with applications that they do want to have workload isolation on.
I agree with pretty much everything you're saying.
Yep.
I feel pretty strongly that this should be addressed at a layer in Kubernetes to provide that isolation. I guess I would also add that there's really, even with installing operators, you know, as we do today, like in a particular namespace, there's lots and lots of opportunity for that to affect other workloads in a cluster just by the nature of being able to run workloads in a shared cluster, right? So there's not a lot of isolation that you actually get. The RBAC isolation is a valid one, but I think making the operators work like other controllers in Kubernetes actually makes it easier for users to reason about what the permissions they're doing are, because they can choose to grant or not grant them in a particular namespace, right?
Yeah.
For example, like you can install, if we wanted to install an operator in a cluster, and you really had really strong policies about what it was allowed to do, you could come in after the fact and you could add a bunch of deny RBAC rules, and that operator wouldn't be able to actually create a pod in some namespace or something like that. Or maybe you're using OPA and Gatekeeper to implement some policies, and you know all of your operators are installed in this particular way and can't do anything. But that again is like a separate layer that's less with how you're stamping out operators in a cluster and more with how you're controlling them with the tools that Kubernetes has today.
Right, essentially establishing roles and role bindings for their service accounts and things like that. Okay.
I mean, that almost sounds like another operator or another component. I don't know. A separate
we actually have an operator that does that, yes.
Yeah, so that can work in tandem. And I think more broadly, I think the problem you're describing is really just like the need for a harder multi-tenancy model in Kubernetes, like the namespaces provide and the projects and the organization, they provide like a soft version. And it really seems like, as Evan is saying, like to solve it properly, you need support for hard multi-tenancy, which Kubernetes doesn't really provide, and sort of the multi-tenancy working group doesn't really have a solution either. So there's no real way, I think, to, besides, as Evan pointed out, going the singleton route with RBAC to provide that sort of harder multi-tenancy that I think your customers are describing.
Yeah, and I guess I don't have a problem with that, with managing, you know, the permissions of an operator. Now it comes down to how do we make that user experience something that is easier to administer for customers. If we're going to say that operators are intended for things like deploying applications or services, they're the deployment aspect, and there's another aspect of to how do you actually put RBAC around that, so that you know, if they're doing things like trying to watch all namespaces in a cluster and have cluster permissions to do that, how do you scope that down so they can only watch certain namespaces? Mechanically, I know how to go. Mechanically, I know, you know, how to go in and do that, but the user experience for them to actually go through that, you know, could probably be improved, right?
Yeah, and there is there is an RFE in the OLM repo that I'll link as soon as I stop talking, where we talk about adding an Android permissions like feature to OLM,
yeah,
which will basically, when you install the operator, you'll be able to say like, oh, give it these permissions, but not these other permissions. And the, you know,
that's not exactly how it would work. It would be, you need to have somebody of at least the permissions that the operator is requesting to install the thing. So anytime that expands with an upgrade or on initial install is when you need to have somebody with the proper permissions come in and say, oh, what is this thing actually looking for? Let me improve the difference.
Yeah, and I think it also needs, it needs some validation checks around it too, right? So if you're telling an operator that has watch permissions in a certain namespace, but you haven't given it update permissions in that namespace, then its ability to actually respond in that namespace to something it sees by, creating, changing, updating resources in that namespace, if it doesn't have those symmetrical permissions, then it won't be able to fully, complete its reconciliation loop, if you will. So it does get fairly complicated fairly quickly, right?
It does, and this is what I want to make sure we think through and have good answers for, especially with, I think this is something that SDK could help with a lot.
Yeah.
If you had something that just checked for permissions, and if you don't have permission to do your stuff, the only thing it does is it writes out a status saying that, basically. That's something that would be a fairly straightforward pattern that we could implement.
And it also seems to need to be some coordination between watching and doing, because they're actually done in two different places, right, in the operator. And those are things that we try to coordinate, with what we're doing and trying to meaningfully expand scope of a namespace to another namespace so that that operator can only work on that other namespace without having cluster permissions, except for doing the expansion. It's a way of trying to control workload isolation that, to make up for what is not there today, I think. I guess it comes down to the use cases that we expect operators to be installed for and how easy we make those use cases to manage for customers. But I think when I joined the call that, well, okay, operators are global. If you want any kind of workload isolation, you just deploy more clusters. And that's starting to sound like VMs, right? So where do you gain the benefit of actually having a cluster that you can use to more fully utilize the VM resources you have by being able to share that in an RBAC way across, multiple applications or services that are running. It depends, I think, on what use case we're trying to optimize.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think to extend that analogy more, it's just that we have VMs right now as our tool, but no one has built any of the kernel features to let us do containers yet. So that's kind of where it seems to me we are in the Kubernetes ecosystem. And we have tried to get around the lack of containers by building a fancier yum, for lack of a better word. But now it seems like I'm not sure that we actually solved more problems than we caused by attempting to do that a layer up. And so it seems like if we just take a step back and say, let's make the yum experience really good, and let's focus on the VM solution and getting the primitives that we need for the container solution, if I haven't stretched the analogy too thin. And once we have one or both of those experiences working really well, then the yum experience works great inside a container, and it also works great inside of a VM.
Yeah, understood.
But I guess I should say none of this was supposed to be sort of an earth-shattering thing. None of this is going to change overnight, and that's why we need to start looking at what your customers are doing, what our customers are doing, what users want, and making sure that we have good answers for all of the things that people are trying to do today.
I think that goes back to the initial bullet point that Chris had submitted, which was whether or not we should talk about this on Slack or somewhere else. And so is Slack the right medium to collect all this feedback, or would a issue against OLM be a better place to do it? So it's surfaced and a better history can be drawn for people that that hear about this intended change and want to submit feedback.
I'm okay with either one.
Evan, do you have a strong opinion?
We probably, yeah, I mean, probably both, honestly. This is not a thing that we should, I think, rush into.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think given how strongly everybody feels, it's something we want to coordinate with as many people and as much input as we have before we make any final decisions. So like you said, I will take the action item of getting an RFE. I will, in fact, post in the Google group to everybody, and we'll include links to the 2 recordings that we have, specifically the previous OLM feature meeting and this one as well. And I will link the issue, and we can, if anybody ever wants to ask just a quick question before they post to the issue, they can always reach out to us on Slack. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay.
Thank you.
Circling back to the proposed agenda, we don't have any items, so we can continue discussing this if everybody would like, but if we feel as though communicating about this issue in Slack and the GitHub issues, and very likely, in future working group meetings, we can end this topic and we can move on to something else or end the conversation for today.
I don't want to be disruptive in the conversation. I'm going to obviously go back and review some more what you guys presented last week. But I think we need to give clear guidance to our collective customers on how to use operators and when to use them and how to control them. Or they will develop processes around that themselves, and maybe that's what I'm dealing with. But that would probably be part of the whole discussion. So we'll just let that emerge through that channel.
That's a very good point, and maybe what we should do, in that issue is highlight everything that Evan laid out so neatly in the future planning meeting to explain why we want to make these changes, right? And how we would propose people move forward knowing that this change may occur, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Or at the very least, we can outline how we hope people will behave. There's nothing we can do about that. Okay, great. All right, on that note, I think that's everything, unless somebody else wants to present something in the meeting. Any takers? Going, gone. All right. On that note, I'm going to call this meeting, and we'll see everybody next week at the OLM feature planning meeting. Thanks for being here and being part of the conversation, everybody.
Thank you.